It's Wednesday. Once again, let's take a look at some DeFi charts for Brave New Coin. Starting off with my usual North Star barometer, the DeFi perp, which is a DeFi index on FTX. It's been a rough and rocky road ever since we broke down below the range support. Had a series of capitulations from people. May 18th was the big one everybody knows about. There was a smaller one after that. An even smaller one slowly over the past week or two. And in general, all of the charts kind of look like one of two things. They either look like a descending triangle, which I'll show on all of them if it's there, or an inverted head and shoulders, which comp makes the best case for. I'll show that as well. But interestingly, the DeFi perp itself kind of has a poor case for both and is more or less setting up for a falling wedge. The thing about chart patterns is when they're unclear across all the market participants, you kind of have to look for the best versions of them to get a big picture of what's going on. You know, this was like the dream scenario in November, December, October. October, November, December. I'm really bad with calendar months. Don't ask. Anyway, November, December, where you have this tight, specific across all or most of the participants, even non-participants of this index had this triple bottom inverted head and shoulders setup. Very clear signal to the entire market that, okay, this is what's going on. Even if it wasn't a signal, it was a sentiment gauge for what was going on at that time leading into January. So the expectations with stuff like this isn't we're going to go to infinity like we did in January. It's just this is probably a bottom and it's a good time to buy, right? So to see a bit of a mess as far as what the charts look like across the board, I don't think you're going to see just a broad DeFi-wide strength at the same time, necessarily. I think you're going to see, if we do pop up, you know, basically we'd have to return back to this range on the DeFi perp to get some strength. And if this is some sort of diagonal inverted head and shoulders, which is possible on a few of these charts, you're going to see us pop back to 12, 13 on this index. So that's also something to watch for. But it needs volume. It needs to be above the 200-day moving average, and we need a 5200 cross. Something else to watch is gas prices, specifically post EIP 1559, even though I don't think personally that they will affect gas prices, or that EIP 1559 will affect gas prices. It's just going to be interesting to see what they look like post EIP 1559, how much is burning. You know, fees are zero post EIP 1559. Very little ETH is actually being burned at any given time, right? The narrative is ultrasound money, triple halving, blah, blah, blah. But until it's here and we're seeing it happen and fees are somewhat elevated, that's when this accrued supply soak starts to kick in. Starting with comp, which has the best example of a building inverted head and shoulders. This doesn't mean it's going to complete. It doesn't mean it's going to break out as expected. It just means this is what I'm looking at. This is what to look for ahead of time. People say TA is lagging. Well, I'm here to tell you that here's the prediction right here. If we break 500, it's going to 750. This may take a week, a month, probably not 2 months. We'll probably know it within a month if this thing can actually move. I like that the 50 and the 200 have zeroed out, meaning they're touching, they're close together. All of this exuberance from January is gone. It's basically retraced most of the January breakout. It's above big volume support. Tap that monthly pivot. The next resistance up is also a monthly pivot. So I like how this sits on support resist. I like how it sits on the trend stuff. I like how volume is declining and descending. So the trade is from 480 to 750 if this breaks out. So that's something to watch for, right? You're going to see us cross above the 200. You're going to see a golden cross on the daily. This is the cleanest and best example of this right now in the market. Everything else is kind of just not as good as this as far as setups are concerned. One thing that could severely dampen all of this is any US regulatory or regulatory stuff from across the board. So always keep that in mind. That's going to mess this up, right? If that comes sooner rather than later, all of DeFi is going to take a hit, I assume. And Maker kind of has the opposite, where it has this macro head and shoulders. It still has that diagonal setup, diagonal head and shoulders. It does have a pending death cross, but there's no clearer example of this. You know, when this breaks 480, 500, the market's going to know what to do. When this breaks above the 50, I don't think the market's going to be as exuberant. But I like how this sits sort of above and inside of the volume stuff. And the big support is at 2K. If this thing breaks 2K, it's not going to do it by itself. The entire market's going to be slumping if that happens. So keep that in mind. None of this stuff is necessarily going to move on its own. Here's Aave, another example of this diagonal inverted head and shoulders setup with this death cross that happened. Basically, all of the bullish trend stuff got reset. So for me, if we don't make lower lows, that is a massive go time. Even though it's out of the pitchfork, this is a multi-year pitchfork. Until this makes lower lows, the expectation here is kind of, yeah, this is probably going to be okay above 285, from 285 to probably 530. I don't know, somewhere up there. The targets for these diagonal patterns are a bit messier because you don't have a flat horizontal to measure off of. But it looks like some of this bleeding may be over in the near term. We're getting weaker waves of selling, certainly. This is SNX and this thing's just all over the place. This just, I can't imagine actually trading this on low time frames, on high time frames. This is kind of like, if you think it's going to be around, it's just a buy and hold. If it's got protocol problems, you dump it, right? That's what I've had to do for the DeFi portfolio. There were some issues with the integrity of what was going on leading into May. So this one does have a death cross on trend. Historically, it's mostly been bullish. Has this diagonal inverted head and shoulders thing-ish as well. Until it gets back above the 200, I think this thing just kind of chops around. And as far as the volume on Kucoin, this is not normal. This stuff pre-2021, leading into 2021, from January to May, that looks real. Then it was fake or gone, right? Then this made you real again. I don't know. But this is not a normal volume profile on anything where the exchange has legitimate volume. So keep that in mind. I only look at the KuCoin chart because they have most of the historic trading history relative to Binance. Link as well, it has this diagonal inverted head and shoulders, but it continues to make lower lows. Not quite a bullish divergence. Death cross below the pitchfork. If the entire market pulls up, Link's going to pull up with it. It's just on its own, this does not look particularly bullish, specifically on trend. You could argue falling wedge. You could argue descending triangle. It's a bit of a mess as far as the signal from chart patterns. So it's almost better to ignore this and just look at the broader market. Look at the index, see how that looks, because Link is going to move with everything else. Band as well, diagonal head and shoulders potential, inverted head and shoulders, kind of sitting in between these volume bands. Probably goes back to 9 or 10 plus if this breaks out. But ideally, you're always looking for that horizontal, because that tells everybody if we break that, shorts get stopped out, longs get opened or added to, that sort of thing. Always the cleanest way to do it. Uni, again, what is this here? Is this an inverted head and shoulders? Maybe. It's looking more like descending triangle to me. Death cross on the daily. Most of the volume is lower, but again, this isn't going to go against the rest of the market. If DeFi recovers in a big way, Uni's not going to break down, I don't think. Here's Sushi, death cross 1 or 2 weeks ago. It's in this pretty large falling wedge, diagonal head and shoulders again, as well as pretty good case for this bear pitchfork, which if we can start to close above this and into the cloud, I still like 14, 10 to 14 is a good price where we could look like we're more than just a mean reversion, but still be bearish and within the realm of continuing to fill this thing in to the downside. But we've got to break this midline, we've got to break the cloud. You can see how he broke the midline, started to break into the cloud, didn't have a bullish TK cross, and then just got smacked down. So to be super sure of any breakouts going forward, you definitely want this bullish TK cross with price in the cloud above the midline of the sell-off since April, right? Like that's all the things you need to check off in order for this thing to have a chance to get to 10 to 14. Curve, much like Uni. Is this a descending triangle? Is this an inverted head and shoulders? It looks more like a descending triangle to me. Tons of volume support below 80 cents. And volume has kind of dropped off to nothing on Binance. Death cross a couple weeks ago. So it's pretty clear where the support resists are. based on diagonals, based on horizontals, right? If this thing moves higher, it probably doesn't go past 3 in the near term, but this does have a bearish bias to it. BAL has more of a diagonal inverted head and shoulders, complete January retrace as of mid-June, still pretty far away from the 200-day moving average. So if you're bullish, it's simple. You don't want to see lower lows. You definitely don't want to see anything in below 14, below 12. Then there's just nothing, right? There's just this abyss of no support, and you're definitely going for all-time lows at that point. If this breaks 12 to 14, I think it probably goes to 7. It probably goes and retests the November or October low. So if you're bullish, you don't want that to happen. BNT also has this aggressive diagonal resistance, pretty far away from the 200-day moving average, and could pull up to around $4 if we get a broad retrace to the upside. ZRX, a mess, potential triple bottom inverted head and shoulders thing, right? I don't know. This one is probably the weakest case for anything. It's just complete chop up and down. But if this does break maybe 70, probably goes and retests 115, I don't know. Just a complete mess, right? You can't really look at this and trade this without looking at everything else. 1 inch doesn't really look like anything else. It's got this definite falling wedge curvature to it. Lots of volume here at these lows. This is a multi-month high on Binance for volume on the 8 hour. And the next volume support down is basically the January open at around $1.26. Currently at $1.87. Resistance at 250, resistance at 4, resistance at 5. Oddly enough, no bullish divergence here, but this is probably an all-time low for the 8 hour RSI. So very heavy selling there at those lows. Probably a lot of capitulation going on with some of these tokens that people have been holding since they got them in the airdrops. Here's Melon or Enzyme. Pretty noisy in general, low cap, probably not a lot of liquidity, which is why you see these big spikes up and down. But since June 2020, it's held this diag, and it's close to breaking that, so it definitely needs to hold that level in the near term for any continued upside. So in general, things don't look terrible. Yes, we made another low kind of equal to the mid-June lows, but I'm still hopeful, optimistic that this stuff can turn the corner in the near term. Lastly, I'll just mention the ETH-BTC fund and DeFi portfolio I trade for Techemy Capital on Enzyme.Finance, non-custodial portfolio management tool where you can send ETH to USDC or just watch what I'm doing. You can see AUM performance allocations. We started this thing in kind of mid-April, which is timing wasn't great based on what happened after April. But here you can see everything that I'm trading or holding. You can see the places I'm getting yield through Aave, through Comp, through Yearn. And for the most part, I'm just going to hold this stuff here because, again, DeFi doesn't look as tragic as it has been, despite just this heavy reversal that we've had over the past 2 weeks. And for BTC and ETH, I'm just waiting for anything, really. ETH broke that 2K level, had to cut it. BTC broke 30K, had to start to cut it. Bigger bounces today. Some of it based on this conference that's going on. But in general, things don't look good enough to buy or bad enough to buy just yet, in my opinion. Anyway, that's all I have for this one. Like, dislike, comment, share, subscribe, and happy trading.